The shuttle's interior was quiet, its hum barely audible over the occasional clack of boots against metal flooring. Most of the passengers were Union military or diplomatic personnel, accustomed to long interstellar trips, each lost in their own tasks or thoughts. That silence broke like glass when an 8-foot-tall reptilian officer stopped in front of a seated human soldier. "Move it, human," he growled, voice low and gravelly. "That's a designated Calaxian rest station." The woman didn't even glance up from her datapad. She remained seated, scrolling through mission logs with her left hand while the fingers of her right tapped an irregular rhythm on her knee. She looked calm, composed, almost bored. Commander Zev Tarek's scales flushed to a bright, menacing orange, the Calaxian equivalent of rage. "Did your primitive auditory organs fail to process my command?" he hissed. "This section is reserved for military personnel of actual consequence." Now she looked up, her brown eyes steady, calculating. Her uniform, while lacking insignia or rank, was impeccably kept typical of the Terran Defense Force. Despite lacking visible symbols of authority, her presence spoke volumes. Her voice, when she responded, was calm and matter-of-fact. "I heard you," she said. "I'm just choosing to ignore you because you're being an ass." A collective gasp echoed through the shuttle. Passengers of various species froze, unsure of whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. Insulting a Calaxian officer, especially a decorated one, was unheard of, practically a death sentence. "I am Commander Zev Tarak of the 7th Calaxian Battle Fleet," the lizard-like alien barked. "A decorated hero of the Orion conflict." The woman finally powered down her datapad and gave a slow sigh. "That's great," she said, gesturing vaguely at the near-empty shuttle. "But there are at least 30 open seats. Why don't you sit in one of those and spare us both the headache?" Zev Tarek's tail snapped against the floor in anger. "This is not about availability. It's about principle. Your kind has only been in space for 2 centuries. You haven't earned the right to sit wherever you please while superior species remain standing." The human arched an eyebrow. "Superior species? That's a bold claim." "It's not a claim," he spat. "It's scientific fact. Humans are classified as a Class C sentient race barely above microbial slime molds." She laughed. Not out of sarcasm or hostility, but as if she'd just heard a child insist the sky was green. "You guys are still using that outdated FTL-based classification system? No wonder this whole union's a mess." Zev's clawed hand hovered near the ceremonial blade at his belt, not drawing it, but making sure she saw the threat. "Final warning, identify yourself and relinquish the seat." She sighed again, this time deeper. "Fine. Jackson. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Jackson, Terran Special Operations Command." A nun rippled through the shuttle. Recognition lit the eyes of a few passengers. One junior officer, a violet-skinned Villian, leaned forward eagerly. "Wait, Jackson. The Jackson from the Proxima Centaur offensive?" She winced. "There were a lot of us at Proxima," she muttered. "It wasn't exactly a small battle." Zev Tarak scoffed. "Human exaggeration. Your kind's role in the Centaur campaign was minimal." "No, sir," the Villian officer countered earnestly. "My academy instructor said human forces broke the hegemony's quantum defenses. It was a pivotal moment." "This isn't a history lecture," Zev barked. "It's about respect. Lower species should know their place." "I've had a long day," Jackson replied. 3 weeks on the frontier trying to stop guerrilla fighters from blowing up one of your colonies, by the way. So how about you stop with the superiority complex and let me enjoy the next 20 minutes in peace?" Zev's scales were practically glowing with fury now. "You will be court-martialed for this insubordination." Just then, a soft ding rang overhead. The shuttle's AI announced, "Now approaching Centaur Prime. Please secure all personal items." Jackson stood casually, grabbing a small duffel from under her seat. "Well, would you look at that?" she said with a half-smile. "Problem solved itself." She moved to the aisle, brushing past the seething Calaxian. But Zev wasn't done. He stomped after her, still bellowing. This is not over, human. When we dock, I will personally escort you to Union security." She didn't even turn around. Yeah, she said, waving a hand dismissively. Looking forward to it. Then it happened. Accounts of what followed varied, but all agreed on one thing. The moment Zev Tarek reached out to grab her shoulder, Jackson moved. Fast. Too fast for a human. She ducked, pivoted, and with a twist of her hips and a flick of her arm, the towering reptilian slammed into the bulkhead with a resounding thud. The shuttle fell silent. Zev groaned on the floor, more stunned than hurt. Jackson stood over him, no longer relaxed, but now radiating a quiet, deadly authority. "Here's some advice," she said evenly. "Don't put your hands on people without asking, especially not on those you think are beneath you. We tend to get a little jumpy." Nobody said a word. The myth of weak, submissive humans had just shattered violently, and the Union would never see them the same way again. For a second, no one moved. Commander Zev Tarek, pride of the Galaxian battle fleet and self-proclaimed superior being, lay sprawled across the floor of the transport shuttle, blinking up in stunned confusion. The moment was frozen in disbelief, like someone had paused reality itself. Around him, passengers of all species stared in open-mouthed shock. Even the AI system seemed unsure how to proceed. Colonel Jackson, standing over the fallen reptilian, didn't look smug or angry, just tired. Her expression was the same as someone dealing with a malfunctioning terminal or a teammate who kept making the same mistake. Calm, restrained, controlled, but her presence had shifted. What once appeared as quiet detachment now radiated something sharper and unspoken authority that filled the room. It hadn't even looked like she'd tried. One moment, Zev Tarek had reached out to assert dominance, grabbing at her shoulder like she was an errant cadet. The next, she twisted, ducked, and turned his size against him with effortless precision. 8 feet of Galaxian muscle had slammed into a steel wall with a sound that echoed through the shuttle's hull. A stunned hush fell over the shuttle's dozen or so passengers. A few diplomatic aides exchanged nervous glances. A group of junior officers who had been watching the entire exchange were now visibly trying to pretend they hadn't, but their wide eyes betrayed the truth. Across the aisle, a glowing-fleshed anal diplomat finally broke the silence with a nervous, buzzing laugh. "By the cosmic harmony," they said, tendrils fluttering with unease. "I've heard stories about human strength to mass ratios, but I never believed them." Jackson stepped back slightly, offering no further aggression. "It's really not that impressive," she said with a shrug. "Just leverage and momentum. They teach it in basic." "Sir Commander Zev Tarek weighs 3 times what she does," one of the junior Villian officers blurted out, his voice a mix of awe and confusion. "Galaxians are known for their armor-like biology, which makes them top-heavy," Jackson said dryly. "Easy to unbalance if you know what you're doing." Zev Tarek groaned as he pushed himself up from the floor, his pride wounded far worse than his body. His scales had dulled from angry orange to an embarrassed yellow-gray. He ignored the hand Jackson briefly extended to help him up. "This changes nothing," he muttered, brushing off imaginary dust and trying to reassert what little dignity he had left. "Parlor tricks don't alter the natural order." A new voice spoke then, calm and amused, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "And what natural order would that be, Commander?" All heads turned. Standing in the corridor's archway was a massive Galaxian with scarred scales and a patch over one eye. His uniform was impossible to mistake, elaborate, decorated and crisp even in transport. Fleet Admiral Krav Zora, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Union. Immediately, the shuttle's atmosphere changed. Officers across species snapped to attention. Even Zev Tarek stiffened like someone had just driven an electric current through his spine. The Admiral's remaining eyes scanned the room. When it landed on Jackson, his expression softened, not something Galaxians were known for. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson," he said with a slow nod. "Didn't expect to see you on this transport. Last I heard, you were still dealing with that mess on Tet 4. Jackson gave a casual salute. "Wrapped up early," Intel from your office was solid, made our job easier. The Admiral gave a low rumble of satisfaction, then turned his attention to the fuming commander. Perhaps you'd care to explain why one of the Union's most decorated special ops officers is being harassed on my shuttle. Zev Tarek's mouth opened, then closed. He floundered. Sir, I was enforcing protocol priority seating. Protocol? The Admiral cut him off. Based on an outdated seating regulation I personally repealed last cycle. You'd know that if you actually read your briefings instead of relying on ancient prejudices. Zev looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. I wasn't aware. Clearly, the Admiral said coldly, you're also unaware that Lieutenant Colonel Jackson is joining my personal staff. She's now Special Operations Liaison for the entire fleet. Which means, he added pointedly, she outranks you. A murmur passed through the shuttle again, this time of recognition, even admiration. The junior officers glanced at each other, their earlier skepticism evaporating into full-blown awe. But sir, Zev tried. No, you're done, Admiral Krev, Zora said sharply. Report to my office at 800 for a comprehensive review of protocol and a discussion about your career. Zev Tarek slunk away, his tail limp behind him. The Admiral turned back to Jackson. My apologies, Colonel. Not everyone has caught up with the reality of what humanity brings to the Union. Jackson shrugged, unconcerned. I'm used to it, sir. And that, the Admiral said grimly, is precisely the problem we need to fix. He gestured toward a private corridor at the rear of the shuttle. If you'd join me, there are things we need to discuss before we reach headquarters. As Jackson followed him, the remaining officers watched in silence. One of the junior lieutenants finally broke the quiet. She doesn't look like much, he whispered. That's kind of their whole thing, another replied. Humans don't look dangerous until it's already too late. And in that moment, the myth of inferiority surrounding humans shattered, replaced by the dawning realization that perhaps they were more dangerous, more capable, and far more essential than anyone had truly understood. The air inside the shuttle remained thick with tension long after the confrontation had ended. Commander Zev Tarek stood rigid, his shoulders square, but his scales still a sullen shade of yellow. He was trying to hold onto the last remnants of his dignity, but the silence that followed Admiral Krav Zora's arrival had made it clear whatever power he thought he had in that moment was gone. He stepped aside and motioned for Jackson to join him. Come with me. There are operational updates I'd like to go over before we reach Centaur Prime. She followed without hesitation, slinging her duffel bag over her shoulder and walking past Zev without a glance. The remaining passengers watched in stunned silence, unsure of what they'd just witnessed, but certain it would be talked about for years to come. Even after the door to the private section of the shuttle closed behind them, the energy in the cabin remained charged. Across the aisle, the young Villian officer who'd spoken earlier leaned in close to his companions. Did you hear what the Admiral said? Special Operations Liaison? That's the highest interspecies tactical advisory role in the fleet. Did you see how she moved? Another whispered. She didn't even break a sweat. She doesn't look like much, the third one said, voice hushed. That's the thing with humans, the first replied. They never do. Until you've already lost. In the back of the shuttle, Zev Tarek slowly sank into a vacant seat, his pride bruised, his status diminished. For the first time in a long time, he had no answer, no counter, no bluster. Only the sting of public failure and the realization that the galaxy was changing. And that humanity wasn't just part of the Union anymore. They were shaping it. After the confrontation, and after Zev Tarek had been thoroughly humbled, the atmosphere aboard the shuttle slowly began to shift from stunned silence to hushed conversation. Though no one spoke directly to Colonel Jackson, they watched her curiously, cautiously. She had become a living contradiction, a relatively small human who had bested a Calaxian war hero, not with brute strength, but with calm precision and absolute confidence. Admiral Krav Zora towered in the archway, every inch of him radiating authority. His uniform was crisply pressed, gleaming with medals and insignias earned across decades of service. One eye was covered with a patch, an old war injury that had only added to his legend, but the other, sharp and calculating, now rested on the fallen commander. "I find it curious," the Admiral said slowly, his voice as deep as planetary gravity, "that one of our most accomplished officers would be treated with such disrespect on my own shuttle." Zev opened his mouth to respond, but the words got caught somewhere in his throat. Finally, he forced them out, each one sounding more feeble than the last. "Sir, I was enforcing priority seating protocol, as established by Union Regulation 447, which was repealed last cycle," the Admiral interrupted sharply. "By me, after I personally petitioned the Security Council to eliminate such outdated caste-based policies. The entire shuttle remained still, watching what felt like a once-in-a-lifetime event. It wasn't every day that a fleet admiral personally reprimanded a commander in front of a dozen witnesses. You'd know this," Krav continued, his voice gaining an edge, "if you read your command briefings instead of clinging to old prejudices." Zev Tarek's mouth opened again, then closed. The usual fire in his stance had dwindled. He looked smaller now, less like a towering symbol of Galaxian strength, and more like a soldier who just realized how far out of line he'd stepped. Admiral Krav then turned to Jackson and his tone softened. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson," he said, "I wasn't expecting you aboard. I thought you were still cleaning up the Tet-4 frontier mess." Jackson gave a half shrug, casual and confident. "Wrapped that up early. Your office's intelligence was right on target. Made it a lot less messy than we expected." The Admiral let out a deep, pleased rumble, a Galaxian version of a chuckle. "Good. I trust your team managed to keep the civilian losses minimal." "Better than projected," she replied, nodding. "But we got lucky on the extraction window." Krav glanced once more at Zev, then turned back to the rest of the passengers, who were still pretending not to stare. "For those of you who don't keep track of these things," the Admiral began, "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson was the commanding officer at Proxima Centauri." "Yes, the Jackson. Her team's actions are still taught as a case study at Union academies." A murmur of recognition moved through the shuttle, especially among the younger officers. The name Jackson had circulated in the Union for years, especially among tactical and special operations circles. Still, few expected to meet her in person, let alone witness her drop a Galaxian officer with one clean move. "Effective immediately," Krav said. "Colonel Jackson is being assigned to my personal staff as Special Operations Liaison. She'll be advising us directly on asymmetric warfare and interspecies coordination." Zev Tarek's tail flicked behind him in a twitch of protest. "With all due respect, Admiral." "Stop," Krav said curtly. "You've already embarrassed yourself enough today. You'll report to my office at 800 for a review of current operational protocols and to discuss the future of your position in this fleet." Zev said nothing. He didn't even nod. He simply stood still, processing the blow. The Admiral looked at Jackson again, this time with something like respect. "My apologies for this incident, Colonel. Not all of us adapt to change as quickly as we should." Jackson gave a small smile. "No apology needed, sir. It's not the first time someone's underestimated us. Won't be the last either." "And that," Krav said, "is exactly what needs to change." A few minutes later, in the officers' lounge at Centaur Prime, the real conversation began. Jackson had been invited, or perhaps unofficially summoned, by a group of junior officers who had witnessed the shuttle incident. Commander Zev Tarek had joined them too, his pride still visibly stinging, but his curiosity piqued. They sat around a circular table in the spacious, multi-species lounge, sipping various beverages, blue for Zev, standard nutrient blends for the lieutenants, plain water for Jackson. The topic was unavoidable. "You said something back on the shuttle," said Lieutenant Enoth, his four eyes blinking asynchronously. "That humans know when to retreat, they just choose not to. I'm trying to understand that logic." Jackson leaned back slightly, folding her arms across her chest. "It's not about logic, not the way most Union species define it. For you, a battle is about equations, projected losses, energy output, probability of success, acceptable margins. Right?" Enoth nodded slowly. "That's doctrine." And that makes sense, she said. For species that evolved in stable environments with long life cycles and slow change, that kind of planning is natural, logical. It values survival over sacrifice. Commander Zev Tarak narrowed his eyes. And humans don't? Jackson turned toward him, expression calm but pointed. We value survival, sure, but it's not always the highest priority. Mission comes first. If the objective truly matters, then the odds don't. The Calexian scoffed. That's suicidal. No, she said evenly. That's choice. It's what makes us dangerous. Lieutenant Exera tilted her head, her membranous wings fluttering slightly in thought. So you're saying humans deliberately engage in battles they know they might not survive? That they ignore probability? Jackson smiled faintly. We don't ignore it. We just don't worship it. The room went quiet. That's difficult to process, Enoth admitted. Every species I've trained with prioritizes efficiency. Tactical doctrine is built on minimizing risk. I've studied some of your military academy's materials, Jackson said. I've read the strategic papers, seen the simulations. You value controlled outcomes. Precision. Sustainability. Yes, Zev said, leaning forward slightly. Because that's how empires endure, not by throwing bodies into meat grinders. Jackson's voice was quiet, but firm. And yet we survive where others falter not because we're stronger or smarter, but because we decide that some things are worth more than our own lives. That's not recklessness. That's commitment. The Villian lieutenant, Valis, spoke up. That's what happened at Proxima, wasn't it? Your team infiltrated a hegemony battlecruiser knowing there was no backup. Knowing there was no way out. There was a way out, Jackson said. We just hadn't found it yet. The room fell into silence again. Even Zev, for all his scorn and resentment, didn't argue. It's not about being brave or foolhardy, Jackson continued. It's about belief. We believe that the mission matters more than we do. That if someone has to take the hit, we'll step forward before we ever step back. That's still insanity, Zev muttered. That's humanity, she countered, looking him directly in the eye. And it's why, despite our inferior technology and our short lifespans, we've become indispensable to Union operations. Because when the odds are impossible and the plan falls apart, and everything is chaos, we're still moving forward. Zev's jaw clenched. His tail twitched behind him, agitated. And that, Jackson said, terrifies some of you. Exera leaned forward. Why do you think the rest of us struggle to understand it? Because most species haven't had to evolve that way, Jackson replied. We're a product of constant instability, natural disasters, predators, tribal wars, famine. We didn't evolve in comfort. We evolved in chaos. And that shaped our values. Enoth nodded slowly, digesting every word. That does explain your unpredictable battle tactics, the adaptability, the improvisation. We don't always know what we're doing, Jackson said with a smirk. We just know we're not giving up. Zev slammed his drink down. So what? You think you're better than the rest of us? Because you charge into unwinnable battles with nothing but hope and stubbornness. No, Jackson said softly, but I do think we're different. And maybe that difference is what the Union needs more of. The silence lingered for a long beat. Then Zev spoke again, his voice lower, more controlled. So when you refused to move from that seat, was it really about pride, or were you testing me? Jackson didn't answer right away. Then she smiled. I was testing all of you. That answer hung in the air, and something shifted. The lieutenant saw it in Zev's expression, a flicker of reflection, of questioning something he had never questioned before. Maybe he didn't agree. Maybe he didn't understand. But for the first time, he wasn't dismissing it. Around the table, officers from 3 different species sat quietly, considering what they had just heard not from a political representative or a lecture in an academy hall, but from a soldier who had lived it. Jackson stood. Jackson, I've got a briefing to prep for, she said, but I'll leave you with this. Logic might win battles, but belief, That's how you survive a war. And with that, she walked away, leaving silence and a whole new perspective behind her. The officers' lounge had only just begun to settle when the door slid open with a hiss. In stepped General D. Tall, forearmed, and every bit as intimidating as his reputation suggested. The conversation halted instantly. Every officer in the room, regardless of species, stood to attention as the commander of the Union's elite rapid response division strode in. "Colonel Jackson," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of urgency. "I was told I might find you here." Jackson stood, her tone shifting immediately into business. "Sir, I wasn't expecting to see you until tomorrow's briefing." "Plans have changed," he said curtly. "We've received a priority distress signal from Epsilon Eridani outpost. The situation is deteriorating fast." The room froze. Jackson's expression hardened. "What kind of deterioration are we talking about, sir?" The general's upper arms crossed, an expression of grave seriousness in his species. "The outpost has gone dark. Last transmission indicated hegemony forces had breached the primary defense grid." Her jaw tightened. "How many people are on site?" "Research team, 47. Civilian settlement adjacent to the outpost, approximately 300. Mostly family members." A silence fell over the lounge. "But that's not the worst of it," the general continued grimly. "That facility was conducting classified research into quantum entanglement communication. If the hegemony captures that tech, they'll have the ability to coordinate fleet actions instantaneously across the entire sector." Jackson was already tapping her datapad, pulling up personnel manifests, system maps, and access logs. Her voice was clipped but calm. "We can't let that happen. What's our response time?" "The nearest fleet group is 2 days out. We don't have that kind of time. We need a rapid insertion, covert, low footprint, maximum effectiveness." Commander Zev Tarak, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, saw an opening. He straightened and stepped forward. "Sir, the 7th Calaxian Battle Fleet has a rapid deployment team currently on standby. I would be honored to lead the response effort." The general didn't hesitate. "You're stationed at the Proxima defensive perimeter, correct?" Zev paused. "Yes, sir." "Too far," the general snapped. "We need boots on the ground within 6 hours, not 60. Jackson's voice cut in, calm but firm. "Sir, I have a suggestion." All eyes turned to her. "The TDF Wellington is docked here for resupply. It's carrying a full Pathfinder commando unit, some of the same personnel I worked with at Proxima Centauri. They're already briefed on quantum protocol security. They handled the original transfer logistics for the project at Epsilon Eridani." General D raised a brow ridge. "You're confident they're mission ready?" "They're trained for exactly this kind of op. Quick insertion, minimal presence, critical asset retrieval. With your authorization, we could launch within the hour and arrive at Epsilon within 5.5. The general considered her for only a moment before giving a sharp nod. "You'll take operational command. I want a mission plan in my hands in 20 minutes. Jackson didn't hesitate. "Already working on it, sir." As she turned back to her datapad, the general glanced toward a trio of stunned junior officers Valis, Enoth, and Exera, who had been sitting nearby the whole time. "You three," he said, pointing. "You're with Colonel Jackson now. Consider it a field promotion to our tactical support team," Valak squeaked. "Sir, she'll need officers familiar with Union protocols and cross-species comm systems. Treat this as a live-fire education. No one questioned it." As the general exited with his entourage, Zev Tarak remained standing, overlooked in the sudden flurry of orders. Jackson didn't even look up from her datapad when she spoke. "Looks like you're off the hook, Commander. Enjoy your drink." Then she turned to the 3 lieutenants. "You 3 on me? We've got 18 minutes to plan a rescue op for 347 people from a fortified outpost currently being overrun by the most ruthless military force in the galaxy." Lieutenant Enough blinked, stunned. Is this what working with humans is always like?" Jackson actually smiled as she grabbed her bag and strode toward the exit. "Nope. Sometimes it gets exciting." Hours later, Lieutenant Exera would begin to understand what Jackson really meant. Their troop transport was screaming through FTL space, the hull humming with strain. The Azentan engineer kept muttering that their current velocity was technically theoretical, but no one dared interrupt the planning session happening mid-aisle. Jackson stood over a holographic map of the Epsilon Eridani outpost, surrounded by a dozen human commandos. Despite the speed of their travel and the looming danger, they moved with calm, practiced coordination. "Walk me through the insertion plan again," Jackson said. The tall, dark-skinned woman with a shaved head, Master Sergeant Torres, stepped forward, tapping a series of glowing points. "We drop from FDL here, just beyond the system's sensor range. We use the asteroid belt for cover on approach. Breach point will be the secondary maintenance shaft here." Exera tilted her head. "That's a solid hull section. No entry point." "There will be," Torres said with a grin, patting a demolition charge on her belt. Jackson nodded approvingly. "Once we're in, Alpha secures the lab. Beta extracts civilians. Gamma creates a diversion." The room went quiet when she added, "I'll lead Gamma myself." Torres spoke up, her voice tight. "With respect, Colonel. I know the terrain better. I'll move faster alone," Jackson cut in. "We don't have time to argue." As the ship's intercom crackled to life and the final countdown to drop commenced, Lieutenant Exera watched her new commander with wide eyes. The woman was calm, composed, and radiating the quiet, unshakable conviction of someone who didn't need to scream to lead. And it dawned on her, this wasn't just about tactics. This was belief, and the Union might just survive because of it. As the transport hurtled through FTL space, a quiet intensity settled over the interior. The lighting had dimmed to tactical red, casting long shadows across the faces of the human commandos and their newly assigned Union counterparts. The hum of the ship's engines was constant, almost soothing like the breath before a storm. Colonel Jackson stood at the center of it all, leaning over a floating tactical hologram of the Epsilon Eridani outpost. The rotating 3D projection shimmered with labeled corridors, defense grid nodes, and civilian zones, each tagged with live data from the last known scans. Around her, 12 Pathfinder commandos stood at attention, waiting for their orders not with stiff military formality, but with the relaxed readiness that only came from years of combat together. Master Sergeant Torres, imposing and calm, pointed to a blinking entry coordinate. "We drop out of FTL here, outside the system's early warning net. We'll thread the asteroids using passive thrust silent approach. Entry through the secondary maintenance shaft. Here." Lieutenant Vex, standing nearby with his eyes locked on the map, frowned. "But that's a solid hull section. There's no external access port." Torres grinned slightly and patted a compact device on her belt. "There will be once this charge says so. Quiet breach, minimal signature." Jackson nodded. "Good. Once we're inside, Alpha Team secures the Quantum Research Lab. Our intel says the prototype is likely stored beneath the main floor in a secondary vault. Beta Team will handle civilian evac. There's a maintenance corridor system we can use for concealment and movement." "And Gamma?" Yav asked carefully. "I'll lead Gamma," Jackson said without hesitation. "We'll create the diversion." Torres stepped forward, concern flashing in her eyes. "Ma'am, with all due respect." "Stow it," Jackson replied gently but firmly. "We've been through this. I'm the fastest moving asset in unfamiliar terrain. I know the outpost layout better than anyone. I'm not engaging them directly, just creating noise, redirecting attention." "Still," Torres said, her jaw clenched. "You shouldn't be doing this alone." "I won't be alone," Jackson said, tapping her temple. "I'll have full telemetry from all teams and live feed support. Besides, we need every heavy hitter we've got focusing on evac and containment. This is the best use of my skill set." Commander Zeb Tarek, standing off to the side with arms crossed, finally spoke up. "You're planning to sneak past a full hegemony strike force and play bait?" Jackson turned her head toward him. "Not bait, distraction. There's a difference." He snorted. "It's suicide." She met his gaze without blinking. "Only if I get sloppy." There was no bravado in her tone, no need to prove herself. Just a quiet confidence that seemed to defy gravity. The young Union officers Valis, Exara, and Enoth watched the exchange with a mix of awe and disbelief. They'd trained at the best academies, studied every major operation from the last 20 years. But this wasn't a simulation. This was a real mission with real risks, and their commanding officer had just volunteered for the most dangerous part of it. "Colonel," Enoth said cautiously, "the casualty projections for Gamma Team, even with stealth, are unacceptable." "I know," Jackson said softly, "which is why I'm not putting anyone else on that team." Zev's jaw twitched. "So you expect the rest of us to just sit here and watch while you go off and get yourself killed?" "No," Jackson replied, stepping forward. "I expect you to hold the command post, monitor troop movement, and coordinate Alpha and Beta teams. This op lives or dies on accurate, up-to-the-minute intel. I need you sharp, Commander, not offended." He bristled slightly, then deflated. "You're assigning us to Overwatch." "I'm assigning you to the most important job of the entire mission," Jackson corrected. "Information flow. If something changes and we miss it, people die." Her words landed with force, not angry. Just truth. She moved to the weapon lockers, running a final check on her gear. Plasma sidearm, EMP charges, emergency beacon, grappling kit. She didn't pack heavy, she packed smart. As she holstered her weapons, she looked up at the young lieutenants. "If something goes sideways and you need to exfile, there's a fallback route already uploaded to your pads. The evac shuttle will wait as long as it can, but if it has to leave, your priority is the civilians and the data." "And you?" Exara asked, almost whispering. Jackson gave a faint smile. "I've got a date with their command node. Try not to start the party without me." Just then, the pilot's voice crackled through the comms. "Eta to drop zone. 3 minutes. Stealth systems engaged. No signs of detection." Jackson turned back to her team. "Final weapons and comms check. Keep it dark. No transmissions unless absolutely necessary. We're going in quiet, fast, and tight. Stick to your teams, and no heroics unless your gut says it's the only option left." Torres snapped a final salute, her expression tense. "See you at the extraction point, ma'am." Jackson clapped her shoulder. "Count on it." As the team dispersed, Jackson passed the Union lieutenants one last time. She paused. "I know this mission feels impossible." "I've seen worse." "Worse than this?" Enoth asked incredulously. She gave a dry smile. "Much worse. You just haven't lived long enough in the field." Zev Terek studied her for a long second. Then, without further comment, he nodded. The moment the ship lurched out of FDL, everything changed. The lights shifted to deep red. Silence fell. Hearts beat faster. Colonel Jackson stepped to the breach bay, her silhouette framed by the glowing red panel of the blast door. "Let's go make the hegemony regret showing up," she said calmly as the hatch hissed open. And then she vanished into the black. The hull vibrated with a low hum as the ship eased out of FTL. Inside, the atmosphere turned electric. Every soldier aboard, human and non-human alike, shifted into silent readiness. The lights dimmed to deep crimson as the stealth systems fully engaged. No alarms, no klaxons. Just a voice over the intercom, calm and measured. Approach vector confirmed, no signs of detection. Commence deployment protocol. Jackson's voice followed, clear and firm. This is it. No comms unless absolutely necessary. You know your assignments. Execute with precision. The ramp lowered, revealing the asteroid field that masked their insertion. Aboard the transport, Alpha, Beta, and Gamma teams slipped into launch pods and shuttles, dispersing in near silence like a whisper across the void. Back in the makeshift command post deep within the shuttle's aft section, Union Lieutenants Enoth, Exara, and Valis hunched over sensor readouts alongside Commander Zev Tarak. Their job: monitor enemy troop patterns, relay vital updates, and keep every team synchronized in the chaos about to unfold. At first, everything went according to plan. Alpha Team 6 of the most seasoned Pathfinders moved like ghosts through the outer corridors of the research wing. Internal surveillance systems had been looped by a virus planted from orbit moments before breach. The hegemony guards, unaware of the infiltration, remained clustered near the civilian quarters and central defense stations. Exara couldn't believe what she was seeing. "They're too fast. I can barely keep up with their movements," she whispered, eyes darting between feeds. The humans were navigating vents, blind corners, and access grates with a fluidity that didn't seem rehearsed but entirely instinctive. "They don't move like soldiers," Valis said under his breath. "They move like predators." Enoth nodded slowly. Predators who already know what they're hunting. Beta Team was no different. Instead of charging through bulkheads or engaging in direct combat, they split into smaller units, sweeping the civilian sectors in carefully planned loops. They avoided patrols entirely, using back routes and maintenance hatches to pull families out in small waves. Children were silenced with a nod, or a touch, somehow understanding the gravity of the situation just by looking at their rescuers. "Beta's cleared Corridor 7, Zev reported, now fully invested. "Evac Route B is open. Send them through Filtration Bay 4 hegemony troops just redirected south." The young officers worked quickly now, adrenaline taking over hesitation. They were no longer watching in awe. They were part of the rhythm. And then there was Jackson. Her feed wasn't audio or video. It was telemetry, only motion tracking. Atmospheric readings, occasional infrared. Even that felt risky. But every data spike was like a line in a story being written live. Vent duct accessed. Subgrid power rerouted. Fire suppression tripped near the secondary barracks. Lights in Corridor 6 flickered and died. Confused voices echoed faintly over intercepted hegemony comms. "She's not fighting them," Eno said in disbelief. "She's outmaneuvering them," Exara corrected. "Using their own systems against them," Valis added. "She's playing the entire outpost like an instrument." Zev Tarak didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the movement patterns on the way entire platoons of hegemony troops were being pulled away from civilian zones and repositioned toward false targets. One moment, they were marching in formation. The next, they were in chaos. "She's redirecting their forces without firing a shot," Zev murmured. "Unbelievable." And then laughter. The telemetry showed a vent camera capturing Jackson dangling from a ceiling conduit, legs braced against crossbeams as she let a patrol pass beneath her. The sound feed crackled just long enough to catch the unmistakable sound of her chuckling to herself. "She's laughing," Vex said, stunned. "Why is she laughing? Why is she laughing?" "Because it's working," Zev said, his voice a mix of disbelief and something else, respect. Back on the screen, Alpha Team reached the lab. The primary entrance was sealed, but Torres had already anticipated that. A compact breaching tool hissed, superheating the lock before snapping it with silent force. Moments later, the team was inside, moving quickly toward the underground vault. "Vault's intact," came a brief encoded transmission. "Prototype located, securing data core and dismantling core backups." Beta, meanwhile, had nearly completed its task. Over 200 civilians had been pulled to safe zones. Medical checks were brief, but thorough. Children were being grouped for extraction. It was working against all odds. It was working. But in war, nothing perfect lasts. "They've caught on," Exara said sharply, pointing to a shifting mass of red markers. Enemy commanders rerouting patrols back toward the civilian sector. "They're adapting," Enoth added grimly. "They're tracking the pattern. Jackson's ruse is losing steam." Zev leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "She knows. Look." The telemetry feed showed Jackson changing course, no longer dancing along the edges, no longer teasing the enemy with tricks. Now she was sprinting straight toward the most heavily guarded section of the outpost. "She's drawing them," Zev said quietly, "pulling the whole formation with her." "She'll never outrun them," Valis whispered. "She's not trying to," Zev replied, a trace of disbelief still in his voice. "She's sacrificing herself." But Jackson wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was accelerating. The data showed her manually rerouting ventilation systems, triggering alarms in multiple wings, and then overriding the emergency reactor protocols. "She's going to overload the power core," Enoth said, voice barely above a whisper. "Localized blast," Zev added. "Just enough to take out the research wing. She's going to collapse the entire section to buy the others time." The command post was silent. "She's not just a distraction," Exera said, eyes wide. "She's the reason this operation is going to succeed." As the final evacuation path opened and civilians flooded toward the extraction point, the young officers watched the chaos unfold, helpless to intervene, breath caught in their throats. And somewhere, deep in the heart of a hostile outpost, a lone human moved through fire, metal, and smoke, rewriting what the Union thought it knew about courage. One impossible decision at a time. Colonel Jackson was surrounded. Through the tactical display, the command post could see it unfold in real time, dozens of red indicators closing in from every direction, converging on her position near the Epsilon Eridani reactor control chamber. It was the heart of the research wing, the most dangerous location in the entire outpost, and she had run straight into it with no backup. "She's boxed in," Lieutenant Enoth whispered, eyes locked on the feed. "She knew this would happen," Exera said, her voice tight with emotion. "She planned for this." "She's gonna blow the core," Vex said. "Take out the research vault and herself with it." At the center of the room, Commander Zev Tarek stood motionless, staring at the holographic projection. His claws gripped the edge of the console, his tail unmoving, a sign of absolute focus. The room around him buzzed with voices and data streams, but he heard none of it. On the display, Jackson was rerouting power nodes, stacking emergency override commands, preparing the core to detonate in a contained explosion. The countdown had begun. "She's buying us time," Enoth said. "She's going to let herself die so the evac can finish." "No," Ziv said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. "She's not dying today." Without another word, he grabbed a plasma rifle from the wall, keyed open the blast doors, and disappeared into the dark corridor without waiting for approval. "Commander," Valis called after him, but it was useless. Through a yen beat, no one moved. Then Exera leaned toward her console. "I've got a track on him. He's moving fast, cutting through the emergency conduit routes." "Is he trying to stop her?" Enoth asked. Exera shook her head slowly. "No, he's going to help her." What happened next would later be debated across military academies and war colleges for decades. Official records remained clinical and sparse. Localized reactor overload averted. Research wing sealed. Primary objective secured. 2 officers recovered under emergency exfiltration conditions. But eyewitness accounts told a different story. Zev Tarek reached the control chamber just as Jackson was finalizing the final power routing. Alarms screamed around her, lights flickered, and the floor trembled with the motion of converging enemy boots. She turned toward him, half expecting an enemy, half expecting silence. What she saw instead was a Calaxian officer, out of breath, armor scorched, eyes burning with something she hadn't expected. Conviction. "What the hell are you doing here?" she demanded. "Saving your reckless, self-sacrificing hide," Zev snapped. "Now move." "I've got this," Jackson said sharply, trying to resume her work. "You really don't," Zev growled, pushing past her and slamming his clawed hand against a secondary control panel. "You've got seconds before they breach. We're sealing the wing, not blowing it." He started rerouting the power flow, fingers flying across the interface like he'd been studying the system for years. Jackson blinked in surprise. "You read the specs?" "Unlike some people, I do my damn homework," he muttered. "You make a hell of a distraction, but I'm not letting you become a martyr." Together, they created a controlled overload, rerouting energy from the core into structural failsafes, setting off internal collapses that cut off access to the research vault without triggering full detonation. It was risky. It was fast. It was just barely enough. When the bulkhead exploded open behind them and hegemony shock troops poured in, they fought side by side, Jackson with her fluid, human efficiency, and Zev with brute Calaxian power. They didn't talk. They didn't argue. They covered each other, moved as a unit, and carved a bloody path back to the final evac point. They made it out just as the shuttle was lifting off. 3 days later, aboard the Union flagship, Admiral Krav Zora stood before a room of high-ranking officers and senior staff. His scarred face was unreadable as he reviewed the official report. 342 civilians rescued, he announced. Quantum prototype secured. Research wing destroyed to prevent enemy acquisition. Minimal Union casualties. He paused, looking directly at Jackson, her uniform dirtied and partially burned, bandages visible beneath the collar. Then he looked at Zev Tarek, standing straight, despite the scorch marks across his scaled armor. But what interests me more, the Admiral continued, is how a Calaxian commander and a human special operations officer, two people who couldn't stand each other a week ago, managed to pull off one of the most successful extraction ops in Union history. Jackson and Zev exchanged a glance. Necessity, sir, Jackson offered. Perspective, Zev added quietly. The Admiral arched a brow. Elaborate. Zev took a breath. I was wrong, sir. About humans. About their motivations, their capabilities. I let prejudice cloud my judgment. What I saw out there, what she did, I've never seen that kind of selfless determination. It wasn't instinct, it was choice. That deserves respect. The room was silent. The Admiral turned to Jackson. And you. I assumed he was just another arrogant traditionalist, she said bluntly. I was wrong too. The Admiral nodded slowly, his voice deepening. Good. Because I'm making your partnership permanent. Jackson blinked. Sir? I've submitted a proposal to the Security Council approved this morning. We're forming a joint special operations division. No more segregated species. We combine our strengths. Starting with you two. You'll co-lead. Zev looked stunned. Jackson didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, she smiled. Not out of victory, but because something real had changed, not just between two soldiers, but in the heart of the Union itself. The debriefing had ended. The final reports had been filed. The wounded had been treated, the rescued civilians relocated, and the classified prototype now rested in the most secure lab in the sector. The mission, by all measurable standards, was a resounding success. And yet, Lieutenant Exera couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the shuttle. The moment before the chaos, before the operation, before the Calaxian commander had been publicly humbled, and before Colonel Jackson had changed the entire perception of humanity across the fleet. It had all started with a seat. She caught up with Jackson in the corridor outside the Union command wing. The colonel had just stepped out of a planning room, her new badge identifying her as co-commander of the freshly established Joint Special Operations Division. She looked exactly as she had before the mission, calm, unshaken, grounded, but there was something deeper now, a quiet weight behind her eyes, the kind that only comes from carrying more than yourself. Colonel, Exera called out, may I ask something? Jackson paused, turning toward her with a relaxed nod. Of course. Back on the shuttle, Exera began. Choosing her words carefully, when you sat in that specific seat, the one reserved for high-ranking Calaxian officers, you could have sat anywhere. No one else was there. Why that seat? Jackson tilted her head, studying the younger officer for a moment. Then she smiled. Because it was labeled as reserved for military personnel of actual consequence, she said. And I wanted to see if anyone would challenge that assumption. Exera blinked. You were testing us. Jackson shook her head gently. Not testing, offering an opportunity for someone to either confirm the old way of thinking or challenge it. She began walking again, and Exera matched her stride. You knew it would provoke him. Absolutely, Jackson said without hesitation. I was counting on it. Zev Tarek wasn't just a commander. He was a symbol of the old guard, rigid hierarchy, superiority complexes, outdated classifications. The Union can't afford that anymore. Exera hesitated. And what if no one had said anything? What if everyone had just let it happen? Jackson gave a half smile. Then I would have known we had a lot more work to do. They exited onto a balcony that overlooked the Centaur Prime Command Concourse, a gleaming hall of diplomats, officers, engineers, and analysts from across dozens of species. The movement was constant, like a bloodstream pushing life through the Union's capital. "You asked me earlier what makes humans different," Jackson said. "It's not our tactics. It's not our tech. It's not even our strength." She rested her hands on the railing, eyes scanning the crowd below. "It's that we believe things can change. Not just hope believe, and we're willing to put ourselves on the line to make that change happen." Ixera glanced over. "Even if the odds are terrible." Jackson nodded. "Especially then." They stood in silence for a while, the weight of her words settling between them. "You know," Ixera said softly, "I've read your file. I knew you were a decorated officer, but I didn't really understand until I watched it happen." "Watched what happen?" Jackson asked. "The way you moved through that outpost. The way you made the hegemony chase shadows while civilians slipped away. The way you talked to Commander Zev like he was someone you still expected to be better, even when he didn't believe it himself." Jackson chuckled. "He came around." Ixera smiled. "He did. I think he even admired you by the end." Jackson shrugged. "Takes one crisis at a time." "But you knew it would work," Ixera insisted. "You believed he could change." "I didn't know," Jackson admitted, "but I believed it was worth finding out." They turned as footsteps approached. Commander Zev Tarak himself came into view, still marked by the burns and bruises of battle, but walking with a newfound calm. He inclined his head politely toward Ixera before focusing on Jackson. "They've assigned us temporary quarters near the command center," he said. "Joint briefing starts in 2 hours." Jackson gave him a nod. "I'll be there." He lingered for a moment. Then, awkwardly but sincerely, said, "You did well. At Epsilon. And I was wrong." Jackson's tone was soft but steady. "So was I." He gave a sharp nod, then walked off without another word. Ixera watched him go, her antennae twitching in curiosity. "Do you think the others will change too? The ones like him?" Jackson exhaled slowly. "Some will, some won't. But that's not the point. Then what is?" "The point is that we show up anyway," she said. "That we don't wait for permission to take the seat. That we take the risk of being challenged, because if we don't, nothing changes." She turned back toward the concourse, where the buzz of duty and diplomacy continued. "The Union isn't going to change on its own. It needs friction, pressure, people who disrupt the cycle." Ixera nodded, quietly inspired. "And that's where humanity comes in?" Jackson smiled, this time with a fierceness that radiated conviction. "Exactly. We don't just adapt to systems, we break them open and rebuild them better." As she walked away to join her new command, Ixera stood on that balcony a little longer, watching the tide of species flow beneath her. For the first time, she understood. Humanity's strength wasn't in defiance for its own sake. It was in daring to believe that the future could be better and demanding a seat in the room where it was decided, even if they had to fight for it, especially then.